Shortly after Marx and Engels pass away, the socialist movement splits into two factions. The factions can briefly be described as the democratic socialists on the one hand and the tankies on the other. Here, democratic socialism refers to movements like the Fabian socialists and evolutionary socialism, whereas the term tanky refers to Soviet-style communism. Socialist activists in England and in Russia began to realize that there were some predictions made by the Communist Manifesto that just didn't pan out. History wasn't progressing in quite the way that Marx had predicted. We'll start with Leninism and Enki ideologies. The story told by the Communist Manifesto didn't really seem to align with what was going on in the East. Primitive accumulation and industrialization didn't really seem inevitable in Russia, since Russia had communal land tenure in place already, but wasn't fully industrialized. In Russia and later in China, a bastard child was born out of Marxism. Since the conditions in Russia and China were so different from those in Germany and France, revolutionaries there took it upon themselves to make a massive revision of Marxist doctrine. Thus was born Marxist-Leninism, followed by Stalinism and Maoism. These are what you might call tanky ideologies. Their vision of socialism departs from that espoused by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. The Bolsheviks sought to bring about a socialist revolution in a country that was not fully industrialized. Marx had held that the revolution could only come about in an advanced capitalist society. Russia at the time was still largely agrarian and was basically already socialist throughout most of the nation. According to Marx, the socialist revolution can only take place when the proletariat becomes so impoverished by exploitation under industrial capitalism that they reach a breaking point and decide to spontaneously revolt. Most of Russia did not have a proletariat or class of wage laborers. This meant that no Marxist revolution would be possible in Russia. Lenin realized this and revised socialism into a new form that greatly departed from genuine Marxism. The role of the proletariat was replaced largely by the role of the peasantry. This is why Leninism adopted the hammer and sickle imagery, with the hammer representing the proletariat and the sickle representing the peasantry. Instead of the majority of people becoming impoverished by capitalist exploitation and revolting spontaneously, instead of the majority of the population becoming impoverished by capitalist exploitation and revolting spontaneously in an almost democratic fashion, as Marx envisioned, Lenin envisioned a vanguard party or elite clique that would take control and impose socialism against the will of the majority. This Leninist vision of Marxism departs from Marx and reverts back to some of the ideas of Louis Auguste Blanqui, especially with regards to the revolution being more of a conspiratorial coup carried out by an elite group than a bottom-up, more of a democratic revolution from the people. When most people think of Marxism or communism today, what comes to mind is actually Leninism, not classical Marxism. The irony of the Russian Revolution is that Russia had actually had a relatively libertarian form of socialism under the Volost system. They had a communal form of land tenure. Agriculture was carried on collectively. Several mirs, that is, local communes, were united into volosts, an administrative subdivision for peasant self-rule. Each commune would be relatively autonomous, and the volost would have an assembly of elected delegates from each mir. For the most part, the peasants had a radical form of democracy for self-government. The commune stood between the state and the people. fines and taxes had to be paid not by individuals, but by the commune. The central government and the Tsar did not govern directly. In many ways, this system resembled libertarian socialism, but the Bolsheviks dismantled and destroyed this system in order to force industrialization and impose state capitalism, which they thought was necessary in order for Marx's vision to play out. They sought to hasten the progression towards communism through accelerationist means. Meanwhile, you saw the emergence in the West of democratic socialism or classical social democracy. Unlike modern social democracy, which is not socialist, classical social democracy was a socialist movement. In the more conventional representative democracies of the West, the Communist Manifesto story didn't seem to be playing out as predicted either. In places like England, society was democratic, and the right to vote was being extended to more and more people. The working class ended up making up the majority of the voting populace, so the workers were able to endorse, support, and vote for politicians that supported reforms that improved their position. Left-wing politicians, backed by the working class, ended up creating rules to regulate businesses. They set standards for safety in the workplace, imposed minimum wage laws, and eventually got the workday reduced to 8 hours. And they eventually ended up getting benefits like Social Security and universal health care passed. And all of this was achieved through the democratic process. Direct action and protest played a role, because that's how you keep a politician's feet to the fire. But the improvements in the conditions were ultimately pushed through by way of the electoral process and existing democratic institutions. Fabians not only saw this as the direction that society was inevitably going in, but also wanted to hasten it along and encourage this social progress. So the Fabians lobbied for minimum wage laws, universal health care, etc. This, of course, meant that no Marxist revolution would ever be possible. If democratic reform was successful at improving conditions for the working class, it meant that no immiseration of the proletariat would ever take place. The working class would never become so impoverished by capitalist exploitation that they would reach a breaking point and spontaneously revolt. Nevertheless, it appeared that socialism might still be possible. It now appeared that perhaps electoral processes and democracy could be used to gradually bring about socialism. Thus was born two schools of democratic socialism: Fabian socialism and evolutionary socialism. Fabian socialism was associated with George Bernard Shaw, the Webbs, Annie Besant, and the ideas espoused by the Fabian Society in England. Evolutionary socialism was associated with the revisionist Marxism of Edward Bernstein. The Fabian socialists, like classical Marxists, still saw socialism as inevitable. They believed that there were economic and historical forces at work that would inevitably lead to socialism. They observed that capitalist competition tended to lead to monopoly. Cutthroat competition would lead to various competitors being put out of business until there was only one company left. They also realized that natural monopolies tend to be taken over by government. Monopolies on the free market tend to provide the worst possible service at the highest possible price, and governments tend to take over natural monopolies in order to protect people from monopoly prices. Natural monopolies like utilities, sewage, and policing are nearly always done by government, as are things like the military. In their estimation, most industries would see the emergence of a monopoly as time progressed, and the government would have to step in and take over control of that monopoly. Capitalism would still naturally lead to public ownership of enterprise. The Fabians also observed that government employees, whether at the municipal level or at the national level, tend to have better wages and benefits than private sector workers. The Fabians believed that once government started taking over enterprises, people would realize that it is better to work for the government than for private companies. So private companies would find it harder and harder to find workers, as all of the workers would choose to work in the public sector. Competition between the public and private sector businesses would put the private sector companies out of business. The Fabians also proposed a land value tax or the collection of ground rent for public purposes. The specific plan they adopted was influenced heavily by the ideas and analysis of Henry George, but this idea of collecting rent for public purposes was the first point on the platform of Marx and Engels's Communist Manifesto. Within this classical movement for social democracy or democratic socialism, Edward Bernstein puts forth his revisionist Marxism and calls for evolutionary socialism. Bernstein's evolutionary socialism departs from the pure socialist ideas of the Fabians and other democratic socialists, and goes in the direction of more like Nordic model social democracy, like we would associate with social democracy today. Bernstein, while still calling himself a socialist, departs from the essence of socialism. He no longer advocates public ownership of the means of production. He questions the Fabian notion that competition tends to lead towards monopoly and that monopolies tend to be taken over by the government. It is true that this does take place, but Bernstein doesn't think that this will inevitably lead to the abolition of private property overall. Some industries, like the provision of electricity and waste management, do get socialized, but other industries tend to remain private. Bernstein also observes that distribution of ownership in places like England is actually starting to become more widespread. Bernstein continues to call himself a Marxist and a socialist because he followed the historical materialism of Marx. He followed the Marxian analysis that sees historical development in a certain direction as being basically inevitable. There are, in his opinion, social and economic forces that determine historical development. Understanding these forces helps one to predict future social and economic developments. Thus, social democracy develops out of Marxism and socialism, beginning as a true form of democratic socialism, but ultimately gets watered down into a more reformist position. It ultimately becomes more liberal and less socialist. Then you have the emergence of Libertarian Marxism. In contrast to these two trends of democratic socialism and Leninism and Enkiism, you have Libertarian Marxism develop, and Libertarian Marxism is more consistent with the thinking of Marx, and it's closer to orthodox or classical Marxism. So, in contrast to the tanky ideologies of vanguard parties and conspiratorial coups, such as Leninism and the democratic socialist trend, there emerges a libertarian Marxist trend, represented by council communism and left communism, which presents a critique of both of these revisionist forms of Marxism. Notable libertarian Marxists are people like Rosa Luxemburg and Amadeo Bordejah. Libertarian Marxism rejected the authoritarian approach of Leninism, Stalinism, and Maoism, criticizing the idea of a need for a vanguard party and party rule. But they also criticized the reformist position taken by social democrats. Democratic socialism, as represented by social democratic parties, tended to get watered down. Thus, social democrats tend to lose sight of the end goal of socialism, which is public ownership of land and industry, which ultimately leads to a stateless, moneyless society in Marxist theory. According to libertarian Marxists, the working class must forge its own destiny. According to libertarian Marxists, the working class must forge its own destiny without the assistance of any vanguard party or conspiratorial clique. The revolution must come spontaneously from the proletariat. The libertarian Marxists end up advocating workers' councils and believing that the proletariat can directly carry on the revolution without any need to be led by political parties. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the autonomous rule of the working class, not the rule of a party or clique as a representative of the working class. Some varieties of libertarian Marxism begin to look like anarchism. Syndicalism develops out of this libertarian Marxist movement. Libertarian Marxism, to be clear, doesn't oppose electoral politics and reform through conventional democratic processes per se, but they insist upon the importance of working class autonomy and spontaneity. Council communism, left communism, and other forms of libertarian Marxism are seen as a third-way alternative to democratic socialism and Leninism. The ideals of libertarian Marxism are more faithful to the spirit of classical Marxism and can be seen as being developments within this tradition. More recent movements within Marxism have been heavily influenced by the libertarian Marxist tradition. For example, you have the situationist movement represented by Guy Debord and Raoul Vaneigem. Then you have fully automated luxury communism represented by Aaron Bastani. These are both Marxist movements. And then you have notable figures like Richard Wolff, Yanis Varoufakis, and Noam Chomsky that have been heavily influenced by libertarian Marxist thinking.